Oh, welcome back. Going to be continuing to finish up this Templar heavy armor. I think I've got all the shapes there that I need, and all the to detail it. Get them into what basically will be his final form and ready to be posed and produced as a figure. So for now, we just make them look pretty. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to make sure that the thickness of this little pipe detail doing across his helmet is essentially bold enough to show up in the final product. So I have it set to view it in real size, the actual production size, at least on my screen. If your screen is the same size as mine, you'll see much the same thing. And if I can clearly see it, chances are it will turn up. I think this borderline good. So that's approximately 0.36 millimeters across. Is a tad too small. It up a little bit. That's almost half a millimeter. But that should be enough. Hopefully. that's what that little seam line will look like. Yep, thick things need to be in order for them to reproduce. So you see these little cuts stuff, they won't show. When I designed that, I was wasting my time. But they look cool on screen. For the goggles, I think it's pretty crowded in there already. So we'll leave it as is. It's got the lenses to carry its detail. Hopefully those lenses up. Done. Barely there, but they're there. Respirator could use just a little bit of attention. Alright, and we got a helmet. For this this chest piece, one thing that I like to keep in mind is how this thing will have to deform in order to be posed. It'll look right. Powered armor, most things are very hard and rigid, so they don't have to deform much at all. It's much easier, but these somewhat softer armors have to be able to move with the body, or at least look like they move with the body. So oftentimes doing detail and then having to pose it and deform those features can destroy the detail, and then you have to rebuild it. So I try to figure out how I can detail it without having to rebuild it. And one of the best ways, but the most tedious ways, is to do what is called a UV unwrap, in which you basically convert the item into a flat piece of geometry, and every point in it is mapped out onto this flat surface. So, and then you go in and you do your texturing and designing. Usually I do it in Photoshop to that flat map, and then when that flat map is reapplied to the 3D object, it's everything that you did design-wise is mapped over it, point per point. So then if you do deform it, all those points move with the deformation, and they stay a lot cleaner. It's not perfect, but generally speaking, I find it to be the best method. And it also allows me to do reiterations and different versions of it fairly quickly, non-destructively, and I can experiment a lot without getting too invested in the whatever design I'm trying to do. So, that's a tedious and boring process to just watch, but sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do. So I'm gonna fire up Blender. Blender is the program I do all my UV unwrapping in. It's free. That's my price point. So, first thing is to get the model out in form that can be imported into Blender. Definitely not a ZBrush file. Pay attention to where I export that to. Alright, the object, and I like to change this to the geometry to keep the vertex order, maintain polygroups. Do an orthographic view, center it, and there we have model. I go into edit mode. I can see through the object. First thing I do is I delete half of it. This is a mirrored object. I only really want to do half the work, so delete half of it. And there now I'm designating where items will be cut, so that when the computer unfolds it, it unfolds it in a way that makes sense to my brain. Now those red lines will be cut. This piece right here, in the back, which will never be seen, is going to be a separate piece. I'll explain that when I get to it. But the front piece is going to lay out flat, and then these tabs will fold out where they're split along the corners. Inside corners, you don't split because they will just overlap when they're unwrapped. I think that will work. Over here on the left side of the screen, you'll see where the model is laid out flat to a square grid. First, on the right side of the screen is where I'm working. Now I've got all the seams that I want, but if I unwrap it now, it's going to deform strangely because it doesn't have the other side to mirror off of. Show you what that looks like. So you'll see that this line here, which is supposed to be a dead straight line, is curved because it's averaging it over the entire shape. So I need the other half to balance it so that line, the center line, comes out straight. So I will add a modifier to this, and it's a mirror modifier. Completes the object. Got a little extra in the merge distance so we don't get any gaps in that seam down the middle. Apply it, and now I have a complete piece, and you notice that it copied over the seams I had already designated. So now when I unwrap it, those center line is nice and straight. Alright, now the insides, which will be completely lost in the model, they'll never be seen, so I like to move those, or move them off to the side. Take what's left, scale it so it maximizes the area in the grid. Redo the orientation so it makes sense to my eyes. Like that's as good as it's gonna get. And the inside pieces here that they'll never show, so they don't matter, but it doesn't matter that they're going to be at a what's called a pixel density. They were scaled at a different size. So any detail that's drawn across these will show up larger or with more detail on the pieces that were scaled larger, and then the ones that didn't. So if I drew a line across one into the other, you'll notice that when it's projected on the final piece, they won't match up. But again, since these will never show, it doesn't matter. The last thing I need to do is I need to actually mirror these, because for some reason when we go from Blender into ZBrush, the axes is mirrored, not only left, right, but up, down. So if I did this straight in and I did something that was, say, text that needs to be read in a certain way, it would look mirrored on the final product. Just mirror the axis and that solves that. Then I'm exporting the UV layout as an image, and this will be put into Photoshop to give me a guide on how to texture. And of course the size is the pixel dimensions of the image. The larger, the more detail you can pack into it, and the smoother curves will be. But for a fairly small item like this, 4096 works well enough for me. It's always best to keep these as square figures, and even better if they are in multiples of 2, so 2, 4, 8, 16, factors of 2, I should say. Because it's easier for computers to do the math on those equations. It just makes things faster. Alright, that image is done. Last thing to do is to export the actual model. I like to go selection only, just in case there's other geometry that I have in there that I don't really want to export out. And then under geometry, keep vertex orders and polygroups. That's pretty much it for the object. Then back in ZBrush, you can import the object. And we have it back in the same spot. You notice the colors of the polygroups have changed, but the polygroups remain the same. And also my seam designations are gone because there's no standard across platforms programs for designating seams, so I have to reestablish those, which isn't difficult. Back for this, I think that's all I need. Alright, so that's most of the tedious part. Hey Gimli, what's a weird glitch? I don't know if I'd call it a glitch, I just think it's just a difference in philosophy. this happens between a lot of 3D programs where they set up their default axes. And of course, ZBrush does everything different, so of course, this is just another thing that's different about it. I'm not sure how the big production houses deal with this. They probably just go into Blender and probably program it to automatically adjust those things. I'm not familiar with that and have never really looked into it. I just flip it along its y-axis and be done with it. One of the most confounding things about ZBrush is that it seems like many of the choices in basic nomenclature were made by an alien. That is very true, but that really stems from the difference in how ZBrush is actually used. I originally came from a more traditional 3D modeling programs. Most notably was Rhino 3D. Which has the standard 4-window layout. You're working in the 3 orthographic views and a perspective view, and everything developed from the early days of like Wavefront and such. So that all progressed naturally, and they kept the same nomenclature. But for ZBrush, it started not as a 3D tool, but as a 2D tool, and what they called 2.5D, which is a 2D view with a dimension of depth. So it was like a impastato in painting, if you're familiar with that, where you just have thick paint and it's a texture. So that's where they originally started from. It was a painting program more than anything else. You develop 3D assets, yes, but they're always done with respect to a 2D final product. So it grew out of that. I don't think they intentionally went in and said, we're going to make everything different. They just came from a different starting point. They grew into the 3D modeling world and had to make a lot of adjustments, I'm sure. And I'm sure there are many, many arguments they had over how to handle the differences. But I suppose that's just a long-winded excuse for why things are the way they are in ZBrush. Alright, so the next part is to tell ZBrush how to handle the UVs in this. Since I exported that image out at 4096, I need to make sure that the UV map in here is handled at the same size, 4096. I need to create a something did not go quite right. Oh. I see, I imported the wrong file. I exported it to the wrong location, and then of course imported an unchanged version of the file, so correct that. Not a problem. Right there. Okay, there we go. Helps if you export it to the proper folder. There we go. what I've done here is I've created just a dummy texture map for it. This just tells me where the various UV islands are. I will clone that and then export it. Hold on a moment. That's enough. Enough. Sorry about that. It makes me go cross-eyed sometimes. Yeah, absolutely. When you've been doing things with certain definitions and methods for a long time, and then all of a sudden you're thrown into this quite different environment where everything works just a little bit differently and it's named sometimes very differently. Yeah, it causes bumps on the forehead for sure. All right. Let's see. First thing I do is I import the UV map here. I will flip that vertically because once again it's not just mirrored between the two, but flipped vertically as well. Brush. Now they map perfect. I have the map, my reference, and then the other one kind of mask. Add in my neutral tone with displacement maps, which is what I'm doing for ZBrush. Is I'm using a displacement map to add detail into it. It's a value system. Grayscale, which goes from 0, which is absolute black, all the way up to 1, which is absolute white. And anything that's above a 0.5, 50%. Anything above that, anything in the white side of things, extrudes out. Anything in the black side of things carves into it. So you need to establish that neutral tone. Is a p-value of 50 enough so that you have that tone where nothing changes. Come over and I paint white over it, it pops out, black, it cuts in. And I recommend any particularly good resources for learning ZBrush specifically, or is it more a poke at it until it works learning style? There is an absolute crap ton of material on YouTube, from ZBrush Central, ZBrush Classroom. just on any specific subjects, how to deal with array meshes, how to deal with most anything. It is out there. Most of it free. There's a lot of paid stuff as well, but most of it, you can find a lot of it for free. Just ZBrush Classroom on YouTube, probably the best first resource, because that'll take you specifically through tour of the interface, the very basic to the very complex. The most important thing that I suggest for people who are trying to get into ZBrush is, there is a really steep learning curve getting used to how things work in a single window environment, or single view environment. ZBrush isn't really meant as a modeling tool, it's meant as a sculpting tool. So most people will modeling in another program and then import it into ZBrush and then do all the fancy. Me, I just model in it because I'm used to it. But you will bang your head against the wall quite a bit. But ultimately, there's only going to be a handful of tools that you're going to gravitate towards. Else, the ones that work best for you. And once you get over that that initial bar, that slope, everything just starts to make the interface, which has been the bane of your existence until that point, just melts away into the background and you work. So it's popular for a very good reason. It's just you just got to keep going through, so you push through to the other side, step through the fire, as it were. Yeah, it is steep. That when you're trying to figure out how subtools work and how histories work in this program, which is different than any other program, how layers work. The program is not exactly in. When you're making stuff, and most of the stuff that you make in the beginning is not going to be very useful. It's very important for you to just, whatever you're trying to create, do it from beginning to end and complete. Because if you just get frustrated and throw it away and start over, all you're going to learn is the very beginning. Go all the way through. Yes, you're going to make an absolute turd and you're going to throw it away, but it's important that you do it from beginning to end, because that is the fastest way you're going to learn what to do when pretty much you're thinking all you're doing is what not to do. Having more luck than you're having with Blender, but I'm coming from almost strictly CAD and looking to integrate more mesh sculpting into my prints. Are you speaking about the mesh sculpting that's built into Blender now? I have not really touched that at all since I've obviously dove deeply into ZBrush. I found Blender to be a problem in the beginning. It has little quirks that are different than other modeling programs. Most notably right click versus left click. There's a ton of resources for Blender out there also, and these aren't insurmountable. Just to quickly illustrate how deformation maps work. I usually use about 5 or 6 different values when I'm doing these, so I can layer them. And I put each of those values on a different layer in Photoshop so that they're much easier. If I need to fine-tune how they relate to each other, I can very quickly do that. But here, let me just throw some garbage on the screen so you can see how it works. So this in the lower, it's the lower left-hand corner. That's the chest piece of the Curious, and you see on the top is where the neck is. Bottom is the waist. So I'm just going to quickly not a hard line. my poor man's mirror. Always want to turn off the grid before I export something. Put in something that's darker. That's another thing. I try not to use absolute values if I can avoid, especially in the beginning. So go 75% high tones and then 25 for the low tones starting out. That way, if I need to add that additional bit of texture underneath it or above it, I'll have a little room to grow. Enough. All right, that's saved. Now I can go back into ZBrush. Actually import that as a displacement map. Go under displacement map, import. I have to set an initial intensity. 0.125 is where I usually started out. Now you can see what I've drawn has been projected over model. That's just an interpreted view. You can see that the surface is still flat as a pancake. Not actually there, it's just really drawn and interpreted on there so you can see what's going on. How you get that to be its final iteration is you have to subdivide model. The more subdivisions, the smoother the detail will get, but of course, you blow up the size of your file. And then you apply it, and there. Now you can see the lighter line got pulled out, and the darker lines got cut into. So you can see how that works. Now for that deformation talking about earlier, this one is the one that I've textured by hand. Applied this texture, about the same. This one, it has a projected map. I came in here and I wanted to make it like he was twisting his torso. We'll get him to punch forward a little bit. But you can see how the detail mapped on it deforms beautifully with it. Absolutely perfectly. It's not there to be interfered with. I do the same thing, one that has the texture actually applied to it. Take off symmetry when you do that. About the same. This is a very basic example of this. See how they are handled slightly differently. When things get a lot more complex, they can get really muddy. Basically, the idea is that when you've sculpted something into it already, it's got a third-dimensional relationship to everything around it. But when it's projected, that relationship hasn't been established yet. You still have control. So if I need these slots to be deeper, they came out and they were too shallow, so I need to make them deeper. Just go to the original image and I make those darker, or I increase the intensity slider under the placement. Can't easily do that. Textures are physically textured onto it. They're already there. Some things fold in on themselves and requires a lot of cleaning, which will happen with projected ones. Right here, this geometry is actually folded it on itself just a little bit there. See where they cross the line, so you have this kind of negative geometry inside a model, which some 3D printing programs don't like. It happens more when you have seams in it and you cut a line across a sharp edge, and as they're cut into it, they sort of fold in on each other that way. Anyway, getting into the weeds, I guess. Back over to Photoshop. So I at a glance what they're supposed to be. And here you'll see, you'll start to see how powerful this can really be. You start to layer these kind of these shapes and effects. I believe this is upside down. That's fine, I can transpose. Now these the lines, this grid here on the UV mesh, you use these to figure out how things are going to deform if they're curved. If everything was flat, all these lines would have their angles set, but of course in the final piece they're not going to be. They're going to be subdivided and smoothed out, so this will be a nice gentle sweeping curve instead of just a short staccato of straight lines. And in order to make sure that your lines stay in with that, follow straight lines will be made curved. It gets very complicated very quickly. Sure. See how it looks. So you see how quickly you can come up with many different layers in your design. Of course, if you don't like the placement of anything or the shape of anything, you can easily go back into Photoshop and fix it. It does take extra time to set up, but the benefits, I think, far outweigh the drawbacks. As you delve deeper and deeper into Photoshop, get even better, you start to add effects add an inner glow. $50. Then flat angled contour. This you have an instant bevel. That back into Photoshop. Sudden your lines just get a little bit smoother. This is a completely non-destructive process. Means that it can easily be undone without affecting any of your previous work. Had the same kind of effect. Changed it. Round over. Camphor. How that looks. They're not nearly as jagged. That's probably too slight to print. Show up on the final product. Everything else looks nice and clean. Again, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe and follow and all that lovely stuff. Set us back to ground zero. None of the subdivisions have been applied, and the deformation map hasn't been applied. You'll see what it look like. Finally it. anymore. Of course, I created all that lovely detail and then it gets covered up by another piece of detail. That's alright. Head down the list to the next piece. Fine detail's not going to get any additional textures. Put it out. This one is such a simple piece, I'm not going to bother eating anything. It'd be just quicker for me to do it all at once. Object can't get too much larger by hand. Doesn't need as nearly as much detail as the Curious. Smaller. I have certain parts of this automatic or scripted, so I can do a bunch of them. Flipping the UV. Setting up that initial file. Happen. That does not look right. I was a little overzealous when I scaled it up, and it went off the edge of the grid slightly, which has strange effects in Photoshop. Other programs, I'm sure. There we go. Got to flip that. Here I'm trying to follow the contours, which are represented by straight lines here, so in between these two there's going to be a slight deformation as they change shape, so I have to try and mimic that. Again, import that as a displacement map. Initial intensity level. Got a little out of whack. Alright, it appears my original geometry wasn't set up quite even, so we're getting this radical deformation right there in this corner. Not gonna solve it. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, didn't realize I had a crease there. That fixed it. All right. Alright, next up is the arms. Now, since the arms are mirrored, I don't really need to do both arms. I can do one UV that'll be applied to each arm, just one will be mirrored, a mirrored version of the other. I probably should have separated this pauldron from the rest of it, as I've already got the detail modeled into it. These are such irregular shapes that I'm not terribly concerned about their orientation. Now, of course, since I only worked on half the model in Blender, basically the right arm, that's the only part that's showing up. Easily solved. Duplicate it, flip it. Now I can, if I want, use two different textures based on the same file if I want these both to be different, or I can just use the one and apply it twice. Flip that UV. And prep the file. This area here should be the wrist, fingers, thumb. Sometimes you gotta guess where things are. Yep, nailed it. Also possible to work the other direction using deformation maps. You have a rather complex piece of geometry and you're not sure how to just go into Photoshop and detail it out. You can actually use ZBrush to make those design decisions. How that would look. Subdivided enough to give yourself resolution to work with. And then you just draw or sketch on the form what you want. This is nothing complex, but this should give you an idea of how it works. You just draw on the form itself what you want, texture map, create new from polypaint. Basically, copy what you've done. Clone that, then you export that. Come into Photoshop, make sure that the entire image is visible, otherwise it won't place the item centered. Transparency in there, you have a guide to where you need lines to go in order for you to make that form. And depending on how well you drew your lines, you can sort of see any wobble in it that will reflect the deformation that happens when you subdivide types of. There you have basically what you mocked up. We have it on both arms. Creases. Go. Or save early, save often. Just like with the chess piece, I'm going to delete half of it. Seems designated. Fire. Buy it. Whole model. Start my unwrap. Inside all the geometry that isn't up. Back the rest. Forget the mirror. More resolution with this one. Put that vertically. Clear the main file. Ready to rock and roll. But something a little more clever that I can do with this blender. Already got my UV laid out, but this is the entire object, and when you have something that's symmetrical and everything inside it is going to be textured symmetrically, you really don't have to have the entire thing. You do need to do the initial unwrap, the whole piece. After that, back in, delete half of it. And you're still left with those center lines nice and sharp. Straight. Essentially, dramatically increase the pixel density of what you're working on. Back what's remaining. You'll have to make sure everything fits bounds. I'd already flipped it previously, so I don't have to do that again. I hope I don't. Else looks right. Where you export your object, add the mirror modifier. Edit mode. Apply it. That not only copies all your geometry, but it copies that that mapping over. Anything that happens on one side is going to happen on the other side, no matter what. Now you can export. Reestablish my creases. The ones I want. Just to give you a quick idea how this works. Drawn some garbage lines there. Everything mirrored over perfectly, automatically. So you only have to texture half of this. The other half's just going to follow suit. that's about time. So if there are any questions, go ahead and post them, and I'll handle them real quick before we call it a day. Anybody at all? Well, I'll take that as either you are stunned into silence or you're not a ZBrush modeler. That's generally where most of the questions will come from. But well, I hope you like the progress on this Templar heavy armored trooper. I think most of the UVing stuff done. So because I split up the boots, just the cuff, sole, and the rest of it's part of the regular model. I no need to UV those will be textured manually. The tedium of UVs is over. We will see you next week. Take care.